Okay, so this last video, I promise I will make it shorter. This one is talking about some of the other elements of Nixon's policies that you definitely should be aware of. So despite the fact that Nixon has a more, I guess, questionable foreign policy with regard to some of the secrecy in Vietnam, he has a more surprising move in his relationship with China. So one of the things, if you were ever asked a question on the AP exam about Nixon's foreign policy, you have to definitely address some of the inconsistencies there. So with regard to China, we see that Nixon actually becomes much more open in his relationship. So it's kind of a surprise move. In this way, Nixon is kind of more similar to Eisenhower in his ability to negotiate with communist leaders and not lose face at home. You can sort of compare that to Eisenhower inviting Khrushchev to visit him in Camp David. So Nixon, in many ways, is trying to build a stronger relationship with China because China and the Soviet Union were not getting along particularly well at this point. So it seems like it's sort of taken advantage of that deteriorating relationship. The first opening of China is actually conducted by these table tennis competitions where Americans travel to China to compete against Chinese. This is significant, even though it may just seem like a simple game of ping pong. This is the first time Americans actually visited China since it fell to communism in 1949. So this is called ping pong diplomacy. And then, because ping pong diplomacy was successful, Nixon visits China in 1972 and meets Chairman Mao. So that's also really significant because this, again, is the first time that you have any Americans in China, let alone trying to develop more positive relations. Nixon's general foreign policy can be described by a word, détente. Détente means the gradual easing of tension, but we talk about détente often to specifically describe Nixon's foreign policy. So we see that there was a new leader of the Soviet Union. His name was Brezhnev. Here he is here. So Khrushchev dies. And he gets increasingly nervous because the U.S. is developing a more positive relationship with China, and so the Soviet Union does not want its relationship with the U.S. to deteriorate. So he becomes much more willing to negotiate with the United States. And one of the most significant negotiations with the Soviet Union was the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, the first one, or SALT. There was a proposed second SALT treaty that never actually was ratified. So SALT I treaty was something that led to a subsequent anti-ballistic missile treaty. So we see that the sort of arms race is declining under Nixon's presidency, which is very important because when we get to Reagan next, we're going to see that actually starts back up again during his presidency. And Nixon also sends Kissinger to the Middle East to try to negotiate a temporary lull in the Arab-Israeli conflict. But this, in many ways, was to ensure the continued oil supply and to increase arms sales to Arab countries. In terms of Nixon's domestic policy, we do see that he is not completely conservative, but he does stray away from some of the more liberal programs. So in the way that he gets more conservative, he places less emphasis on welfare programs. So we see, for example, that the Office of Employment Opportunity, the OEO, that was established under Johnson's War on Poverty, that's going to be dismantled by Nixon in 1973. He also tries to work to support guaranteed income to replace welfare. And he also imposes wage and price freezing to try to hold down inflation. And also he appoints Chief Justice Warren Burger to the Supreme Court, who you see here. And the previous Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was Earl Warren. And so this is really significant because the Warren Court was really progressive. This was the court that presided over Brown v. Board, for example. And so we see a transitioning of the Supreme Court to be much more conservative when Burger becomes the Chief Justice. But like I said earlier, Nixon does have some more surprisingly liberal policies. For example, Nixon was actually the first president to really put environmental protection on the agenda. And this was accomplished when the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, was founded. And also there was a Clean Air Act. There was one in the 1960s, but then there's another one that's passed under Nixon's watch in 1970. And then In addition, this is not an environmental policy, but Nixon also supported deficit spending, which was something that FDR actually supported. So basically, the idea was in order to help the economy to get going again, the government actually was more willing to spend its own money, and that's more traditionally a liberal idea. And in 1969, Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. And this is significant because up until this point, it seemed as though the U.S. was sort of behind in the space race. For example, the first manned spacecraft was launched by the Soviet Union. And also, as we know, in the 1950s, Sputnik was the first satellite to be launched in space, and that was a Russian ship, right? So in some ways, the space race takes a significant step towards the United States' favor. And this was Kennedy's plan, but Nixon sees it come to fruition. One of the more controversial elements of Nixon's foreign policy was that in Chile, he helps overthrow a democratically elected president. So in the 1970s, the president of Chile was this guy here, Salvador Allende. He was very, very popular among the Chilean working class because he was a communist and he started instituting major land reform policies. But as we know, the U.S. does not support communism. We already know that Cuba was a communist country at this point. And so in some ways, we see that this is a threat to the U.S. And they have to sort of continue to at least enforce the containment policy on the Western Hemisphere. So even if Nixon was sort of more reserved in enforcing containment in Asia due to the failures in Vietnam, he was not going to let more communism spread to the Western Hemisphere. And so in 1973, Salvador Allende was overthrown and killed in a coup that we find out later was also supported by the CIA. And so Nixon and Kissinger actually had phone conversations that were recorded and that revealed their support of the CIA intervening in Chile. And the new president of Chile was a military dictator named Augusto Pinochet, and we see him here. And so this is really significant because we see that the U.S. support for the CIA-backed coup means that they were more willing to support a military dictator than to have a communist lead it, even if that communist was democratically elected. So that's really significant because, you really see that with regard to self-determination, that doesn't really ring true in terms of Cold War politics, right? And so in some ways I see this is almost like a continuation of the Monroe Doctrine into the Nixon presidency. And of course, one cannot forget Watergate, Nixon's real dark side, what contributes to Nixon's final decline. Nixon, ever since the 1960 televised presidential debate against Kennedy, never really trusted the media and was sort of a paranoid guy. And so he orders illegal surveillance on many citizens. This is most apparent in 1972 when he tries to spy on the Democratic Party's plans for the 1972 presidential campaign. And so Nixon forms this little inner circle to try to keep information from the public and plug any leaks about the fact that he was spying on the Democratic Party. He had this little inner circle that contained people called plumbers, and the job of the plumbers was to try to stop information from leaking to the public. But we find out later that the plumbers break into a man named Daniel Ellsberg, his psychiatrist's office, to try to find embarrassing information about him and to sort of again give fuel to the Republican Party, but they find nothing. And then later the Pentagon Papers were released, and this is really significant because it makes the public more skeptical of the government's actions in Vietnam. And so again, by 1972, the Republican Party is increasingly trying to figure out what the Democratic Party is up to. And so Nixon gets his re-election committee, it was called the Committee for the Re-election of the President, or CREEP, to run a dirty tricks campaign to try to confuse the Democratic Party. One of the things that they do is they break into the Democratic Party headquarters at the Watergate Hotel, and when they're there, they implant wiretapping devices to try to spy on the Democratic Party. Later, the White House tries to cover up the fact that they were involved in this incident, but there are going to be two younger reporters named Woodward and Bernstein who expose this story to the public because they're able to research that the and that the Watergate break-in actually did go back to the White House, that Nixon didn't only know about it, he claimed not to know anything, but he also actually ordered it. So because of Woodward and Bernstein's journalism, Nixon is going to be confronted. We're going to find that there were secret tape recordings of Nixon's conversations in the White House, and the Supreme Court is going to rule that Nixon had to hand over those tapes, and he eventually complies. These tapes incriminated Nixon's involvement in the Watergate scandal. And so Nixon, facing almost certain impeachment, resigns from office. And so this is obviously very significant because this is the only president who ever resigned from office. So this really is significant in his legacy. And it's also significant in that this is a really watershed moment in history, as well as Johnson's presidency, in that the public is going to be increasingly, and honestly forevermore, really skeptical of the president, and they don't really trust the federal government in general. And this really, in a lot of ways, also shows us continuity. So you can kind of connect this again to the modern day, and the fact that many of the public still does not really trust Washington, right? And so we could sort of link this back to the 1960s and 70s. So that is it for these videos. Thanks for watching. Lucky us, we are almost finished with the textbook. We only have 2 chapters left. The next chapter is the last chapter on period 8, or no, I'm sorry, period 8 starts with the 1980s, so we're basically getting into period 9 here, so we're almost finished with the entire curriculum. Hopefully we'll have some more time for review in class. And that's it for these videos. So thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next week.